The afternoon sun blazed down mercilessly, casting sharp shadows on the platform of a bustling train station. Amidst the chatter of travelers and the screech of distant trains, one voice cut through the noise like a whip. "Don't you dare walk away from me," barked a uniformed officer, his tone laced with contempt and authority. The crowd instinctively parted, their gazes flicking between the officer and his target, a young black girl no older than 17. She froze mid-step, her backpack slipping from her shoulder as she turned, her expression a mixture of confusion and defiance. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. She glanced around, hoping for support from the bystanders, but the crowd stayed silent, their eyes filled with pity and fear. The officer sneered, stepping closer, towering over her. "What do you mean you didn't do anything? I saw you trying to jump the turnstile. That's theft, plain and simple." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? I paid for my ticket. You can check the machines." She fumbled in her pocket, pulling out a crumpled receipt. But the officer didn't even glance at it. Instead, he reached out and snatched her wrist, his grip tight and unyielding. "Don't lie to me," he spat, dragging her towards the edge of the platform. "You people are always pulling this kind of stunt." Her heart raced, panic setting in as she struggled against his grip. "Let go of me." "I didn't do anything," she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the shrill whistle of an approaching train. The officer ignored her protests, his actions growing more aggressive. "You want to break the law? Fine. Let's see how you like the consequences." With a swift motion, he shoved her down onto the tracks, pulling a set of zip ties from his belt. The crowd gasped, but no one moved to intervene. "What are you doing?" she screamed, tears streaming down her face as she kicked and squirmed, trying to free herself. "Help me. Somebody, please." But the officer was deaf to her pleas. "This is what happens when you disrespect authority," he growled, securing her hands to one of the rails. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, the vibrations in the track sending waves of terror through her body. At that moment, a deep, commanding voice cut through the chaos. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The officer froze, his face paling as he turned to see a man in a dark suit and sunglasses striding towards him, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. The man's presence was electrifying, his every step radiating authority and control. He didn't wait for an answer, his eyes narrowing as they took in the horrific scene. "You have no idea who you just messed with," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. In an instant, he leapt down onto the tracks, pulling a knife from his pocket and slicing through the zip ties. He hoisted the girl up to the platform with ease, his movements precise and deliberate. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some filming the scene on their phones, others finally stepping forward to help. The officer stammered, his confidence crumbling. She was breaking the law. I was just doing my job." The man turned, his glare piercing. "Your job?" He advanced on the officer, his voice rising with controlled fury. "Your job is to serve and protect, not abuse and humiliate. What you just did is a crime, and believe me, you'll pay for it." The officer tried to back away, but the man grabbed him by the collar, dragging him off the tracks and shoving him against a wall. "Do you even know who I am?" he demanded, his voice like a thunderclap. The officer shook his head, his arrogance replaced with fear. The man leaned in, his words cutting like a blade. "I'm with the FBI. And you just tried to kill my daughter." The crowd gasped, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The officer's face went ashen, his bravado utterly shattered. But this was far from over. As the sirens of approaching law enforcement vehicles filled the air, the man released the officer and turned to his daughter, pulling her into a protective embrace. "It's over," he murmured, his voice softening. But his eyes, burning with determination, promised that this was only the beginning. What followed would shake the city to its core. Secrets would unravel, and the officer's fate would become a chilling lesson in justice. What happened next? You'll want to stay until the end to find out. At Plough of Twist, we firmly stand against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black viewers, we want you to know that you are seen, valued, and celebrated. This channel is dedicated to telling stories that shed light on injustices while highlighting the power of resilience and triumph. Enjoy the story ahead, and if you appreciate our content, don't forget to hit subscribe and join our community. Together, we can amplify voices that matter. Now, let's dive into an unforgettable tale. The early morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of a modest suburban home, casting long, slanting shadows across the wooden floors. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the quiet hum of life starting its day. This house wasn't grand or ostentatious, but it exuded a sense of warmth and resilience, a testament to the family that called it home. In the kitchen, Maya Jackson, a bright and determined 17-year-old, was seated at the table, poring over a notebook. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked through an essay for her AP English class. Maya was the kind of teenager who balanced a sharp intellect with an unshakable moral compass. Her teachers often described her as wise beyond her years, but those who knew her best also recognized her quiet defiance, a refusal to back down when confronted with injustice. Her world was simple but far from easy. She lived with her father, Agent Marcus Jackson, a senior investigator with the FBI. Marcus was a towering figure in Maya's life, both physically and metaphorically. His job demanded a level of intensity and discipline that often bled into their home life, but it was also clear that everything he did was driven by an unwavering love for his daughter. Marcus had raised Maya alone since her mother's passing 10 years earlier, and their bond was unshakable. He had taught her to stand tall, to use her voice, and, above all, to know her worth. Yet, for all his strength and professionalism, Marcus carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. His work investigating organized crime and corruption often left him jaded, but he never allowed it to cloud his devotion to Maya. To him, she was a reminder that there was still good worth fighting for. The town they lived in, Brooksville, was a place that seemed caught in two opposing eras. It had the charm of small-town America, quiet streets lined with tidy houses, a picturesque main street with a diner and a hardware store, but it also harbored a darker side. Beneath its tranquil exterior lay tensions that simmered just below the surface. For families like the Jacksons, the signs of prejudice were subtle but constant: suspicious glances at the grocery store, whispered comments at the gas station, the occasional denial of service with a forced smile. On this particular day, Maya was preparing to head to school. It was her last week before spring break, and she had big plans to spend her time volunteering at a community art center. Marcus had made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and was scanning the news on his tablet. "Hey, Dad, can I borrow the car this weekend?" Maya asked, barely looking up from her notebook. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Depends. Are we talking responsible driving, Maya, or let's see how fast this thing goes, Maya?" She laughed, rolling her eyes. "Responsible driving, obviously." He set down the tablet, his expression softening. "We'll see. Let's get through this week first." Maya grabbed her backpack and kissed him on the cheek. "Thanks, Dad. See you tonight." She had barely stepped out the door when Marcus's phone buzzed on the counter. A familiar ringtone signaled an urgent call from his office. With a heavy sigh, he answered, bracing himself for the long day ahead. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daniel Travers was starting his own morning. The uniformed police officer stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with meticulous precision. Travers prided himself on being the embodiment of law and order, though his interpretation of those principles was deeply flawed. He had grown up in Brooksville, inheriting his father's outdated views and resentments. Travers wore his badge with a mix of pride and entitlement, believing himself to be a protector of the community, though, in reality, his actions often perpetuated fear and division. He had a reputation for targeting young black residents, using minor infractions as an excuse to assert his authority. As Travers finished his coffee and headed out the door, he had no idea that his path would soon collide with Maya's in a way that would change both of their lives forever. The streets were already bustling as Maya made her way to the train station, a familiar route she took every morning. The platform was crowded, a mix of commuters clutching coffee cups and students scrolling through their phones. Maya spotted a few friends from school and waved, but she didn't stop to chat. She had a test to study for and wanted to find a quiet corner to review her notes. The train was running late, and the crowd grew restless. Maya found herself standing near the edge of the platform, lost in thought, when a sharp voice broke through her reverie. "Hey! You! Step back from the edge." She turned to see Officer Travers striding towards her, his face etched with annoyance. At first, she thought he was addressing someone else, but his gaze was fixed squarely on her. "I'm talking to you," he snapped, gesturing for her to move. Maya stepped back, confused. "I wasn't that close," she said calmly. Travers didn't seem to care. "You shouldn't be standing there at all. What are you doing here, anyway?" "Waiting for the train," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with irritation. "Same as everyone else." His eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me." The exchange caught the attention of a few onlookers, but no one intervened. Maya felt her chest tighten as the officer's tone grew more aggressive. "I've seen you around," Travers said, his voice lowering. "Always in places you don't belong." Maya's jaw tightened. "I have every right to be here." Travers stepped closer, his presence looming. "You think you can talk to me like that? Show me your ID." Maya hesitated, her heart pounding. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. Reluctantly, she reached into her backpack and pulled out her student ID. Travers snatched it from her hand, examining it as if it were evidence in a crime. "Figures," he muttered under his breath, tossing the ID back at her. "You people always think you're above the rules." Maya's blood boiled. "Excuse me? What's that supposed to mean?" Travers didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, invading her space. "You're coming with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Maya's voice trembled as she spoke. "I didn't do anything." "You can't just, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Travers interrupted, grabbing her arm. Panic surged through her, and she instinctively pulled away. "Let go of me," she shouted, her voice echoing across the platform. And that's when everything began to spiral out of control. The officer's grip tightened, and the crowd around them grew silent, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear. Travers's actions were swift and calculated, and Maya soon found herself at the center of a storm she couldn't escape. Back at his office, Marcus glanced at his phone, a sudden wave of unease washing over him. Something didn't feel right, though he couldn't yet put his finger on it. He would soon discover that this day was about to test everything he believed in, and everyone involved would face the consequences. The afternoon heat pressed down on the station like a suffocating blanket, amplifying the already tense atmosphere. Maya struggled against the zip ties biting into her wrists, the rough texture chafing her skin raw. She craned her neck to look at Travers, her voice cracking under the strain of her fear and anger. "This isn't right. You can't do this," she shouted, her voice trembling but defiant. Travers didn't even flinch. His eyes were cold, his jaw set like stone. "You should have thought about that before running your mouth," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He paced along the platform, throwing quick glances over his shoulder at the growing crowd. His actions were deliberate, as if daring someone to intervene, though none dared. In the distance, the faint sound of a train horn echoed through the air, a grim reminder of the stakes. The spectators murmured among themselves, their faces etched with horror and disbelief. A few raised their phones to record, capturing every detail of the scene unfolding before them. A woman in her 40s, clutching a grocery bag, hesitated before stepping forward. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "Officer, this isn't necessary. She's just a kid." Travers spun on his heel, his glare silencing her instantly. "Stay out of this," he barked, his voice laced with venom. "This doesn't concern you." Maya's breathing quickened, her chest heaving as she turned her attention to the woman. "Please, help me. Call someone," she begged, her voice breaking under the weight of her desperation. But the woman faltered, shrinking back into the crowd. Travers smirked, shaking his head. "See? No one's coming to save you," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You think you're special? Think again." The sound of the train grew louder, the vibrations in the tracks sending a shiver through Maya's spine. Her mind raced, searching for anything, anyone, that could stop this madness. Her father's face flashed in her memory, his voice steady and reassuring as he once told her to never back down in the face of injustice. But what could she do now? She was trapped, powerless, and running out of time. Unbeknownst to Travers, the crowd wasn't as passive as he believed. Among them, a young man named Jamal, a college student and activist, had been recording everything from the moment Travers laid his hands on Maya. His hands trembled as he typed furiously on his phone, uploading the video to every platform he could think of, tagging local news outlets and civil rights organizations. "They need to see this," Jamal muttered under his breath. "Someone's got to stop him." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus was wrapping up a meeting with his team. The day had been uneventful, the kind of slow burn that left him restless. As he gathered his things, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he saw a flood of notifications. Clicking on one of the videos, his stomach dropped. It was Maya. His daughter. And she was in danger. "Get the car ready," Marcus barked at his colleague, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Now." Back at the station, Travers seemed almost gleeful as he turned to Maya, crouching down to meet her eye level. "You think you're tough, huh? Always playing the victim, blaming everyone else for your mistakes. Maybe now you'll learn." Maya's lip quivered, but she refused to look away. "You're nothing but a coward," she spat, her words defiant despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You think this makes you powerful? It just makes you pathetic." Travers's smirk faltered for a brief moment, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. His hand twitched toward his belt, but the sound of sirens in the distance froze him in place. He straightened, his expression hardening as he scanned the platform. "Who called them?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. The crowd remained silent, their gazes darting nervously. Travers's confidence began to waver, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He turned back to Maya, his tone low and menacing. "You think they're gonna help you? You're just another name to them." But Maya saw the fear in his eyes, the cracks forming in his facade. The sirens grew louder, closer, their wailing an almost triumphant sound. Travers grabbed her by the arm, yanking her to her feet. "Get up," he hissed. "We're leaving." The crowd erupted in protests, their courage bolstered by the approaching law enforcement. "Leave her alone," someone shouted, their voice breaking through the noise. Travers pulled Maya closer, his grip bruising. "Shut up, all of you," he bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain. But the spell was broken. The crowd surged forward, their collective outrage overpowering his authority. As the first squad car screeched to a halt at the station, Marcus stepped out, his presence commanding and unyielding. His eyes locked onto Travers, and for the first time, the officer's bravado faltered entirely. "Step away from her," Marcus said, his voice cold and cutting. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His words carried the weight of undeniable authority. Travers hesitated, his grip on Maya tightening for a fraction of a second before he released her, shoving her towards the crowd. She stumbled but was quickly caught by a pair of onlookers, their arms steadying her. Marcus advanced slowly, his every step deliberate. Travers instinctively reached for his gun, but Marcus raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't even think about it," he warned. The air was thick with tension, the crowd holding their breath as the two men faced off. Marcus's eyes burned with a mixture of fury and control, his voice low but firm. "You made a mistake today," he said. "A mistake that's going to cost you everything." Travers opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was cornered, his bravado stripped away, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't in control. As the officers who had arrived with Marcus moved in to take Travers into custody, the crowd erupted in cheers. Maya clung to her father, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. But even as relief washed over her, she knew this wasn't the end. The cameras were still rolling, the world watching as the first cracks in the facade of power began to show. What would happen next would send shockwaves far beyond Brooksville, exposing the truth in ways no one could have predicted. Marcus tightened his hold on Maya, his voice steady as he whispered, "It's not over yet." And it wasn't. Not by a long shot. The tension in the interrogation room was suffocating. The walls, painted a dull gray, seemed to close in, amplifying every sound. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. Across from him sat Travers, his wrists bound in cuffs, his defiance visibly cracking under the weight of the moment. The room was silent except for the rhythmic tap of Marcus's pen against the metal surface of the table. Each tap seemed deliberate, calculated, a countdown to something inevitable. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Travers finally muttered, his voice low and sharp. "I was just doing my job." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Your job," he repeated, his voice calm but laced with an edge that could cut steel. "Tell me, Officer Travers, when did your job start involving tying teenagers to train tracks?" Travers flinched but quickly masked it with a scowl. "She was resisting. She disrespected me. I was teaching her a lesson." Marcus's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the pen until his knuckles turned white. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. "Teaching her a lesson," he echoed. "Is that what you call attempted murder?" "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Travers snapped, his voice rising. "She was provoking me, acting like she's above the law, like they all do." "They?" Marcus's voice was ice, his gaze piercing. "Who's they, Travers? Be very careful about your next words." Travers hesitated, his bravado faltering under Marcus's unyielding stare. "You know what I mean," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Marcus slammed the pen onto the table, the sharp sound making Travers jump. "No, I don't. Enlighten me." Travers's silence spoke volumes. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the one-way mirror on the wall as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The weight of the evidence against him, the video recordings, the testimonies, the public outrage, pressed down on him like an anvil. "Do you have any idea who that girl is?" Marcus continued, his voice low and dangerous. "What you almost took from me." Travers's lips tightened into a thin line, but he didn't respond. "That's my daughter," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. For a moment, the composed FBI agent slipped away, replaced by a father whose world had almost been shattered. "My only child. You tied her to a train track like an animal, and you want me to believe it was just a lesson?" Travers opened his mouth, but no words came. His face betrayed a flicker of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by defensiveness. "I didn't know she was your daughter," he muttered. If you had known." Marcus interrupted, leaning forward. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "If you had known, what? You wouldn't have done it? Or would you have been more careful not to get caught?" Travers looked away, his jaw clenching. "This is all getting blown out of proportion. People like her, Don't finish that sentence, Marcus warned, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. He stood, pacing the room as he tried to contain the storm brewing inside him. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about me. It's not even about Maya. It's about every kid you've terrorized, every life you've ruined because you think your badge gives you the right to play God. Travers scoffed, his confidence creeping back in. Spare me the lecture. You're no saint, Jackson. You FBI guys think you're untouchable. You're just like me, I am nothing like you, Marcus shot back, his voice echoing off the walls. The intensity in his eyes made Travers shrink back. I earned this badge to protect people, to uphold the law, not to twist it to feed some sick sense of superiority. Travers leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. You think you're better than me? Let's see how high and mighty you are when this gets dragged through the courts. You think they'll side with you? Or with me? Marcus stopped pacing, his gaze locking onto Travers with a ferocity that made the room feel colder. Oh, it's going to court, he said, his voice steady and chilling. And when it does, you'll wish you'd never touched that badge. Before Travers could respond, the door opened, and a young officer stepped in, handing Marcus a thick file. Sir, we've compiled everything. The recordings, his records, and something else. Marcus raised an eyebrow, flipping through the file. As his eyes scanned the pages, his expression darkened. Of course, he muttered under his breath, slamming the file shut. Travers shifted in his seat, his smirk fading. What is it? Marcus ignored him, addressing the officer instead. Get this to the DA's office. Now. Yes, sir, the officer said, casting a wary glance at Travers before leaving. What the hell is going on? Travers demanded, his voice rising. What did you find? Marcus turned back to him, his expression cold and unrelenting. Let's just say you've got more skeletons in your closet than I expected. And now, the whole world's going to see them. Travers paled, his confidence evaporating. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, Marcus said, his voice laced with venom. The bribes, the false reports, the missing evidence in your cases. It's all here. You've been a parasite in that department for years, and now it's over. Travers's hands clenched into fists, his bravado reduced to desperation. You can't prove anything. Marcus leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. Watch me. The door opened again, this time admitting two more officers who flanked Travers. It's time to go, one of them said, his tone curt. Travers looked at Marcus, his eyes wide with fear. This isn't over, he spat as the officers hauled him to his feet. Oh, it's far from over, Marcus replied, watching as Travers was escorted out. But this time, you're not the one holding the power. As the door closed behind them, Marcus sank into his chair, the weight of the day crashing down on him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. It wasn't just about justice for Maya anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed people like Travers to thrive. And this was only the beginning. The silence in the aftermath was deafening. Marcus sat in the dimly lit conference room, his head resting in his hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, the only noise cutting through the oppressive stillness. In front of him was the thick case file containing all of Travers's misdeeds, years of corruption, abuse, and unchecked power condensed into damning evidence. Maya entered the room quietly, her steps hesitant. Her face was still pale, her eyes red-rimmed from hours of recounting the events to investigators and reliving the terror she had endured. She stood in the doorway, watching her father. For the first time in her life, Marcus looked small. His broad shoulders, usually so strong and commanding, seemed to sag under an invisible weight. Dad? Her voice was soft, uncertain. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The sorrow in his expression made her heart ache. Maya, he said, his voice hoarse. You shouldn't be here. I wanted to see you, she replied, stepping further into the room. They said you were still working. Marcus gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit, he said gently. She obeyed, her movements slow and deliberate, as though the weight of the day clung to her limbs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was heavy with unspoken words, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have been through something unthinkable. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, Maya. Her brow furrowed in confusion. What are you sorry for? You didn't do this. No, he admitted, his hands tightening into fists on the table. But I should have been there. I should have. Stop, she interrupted, her voice firm despite its tremor. You can't blame yourself for what that man did. He's the one who, her voice broke, and she looked away, struggling to maintain her composure. He's the monster, not you. Marcus reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. You're right, he said, his voice steadying. But as your father, it's my job to protect you. And today, I failed. Maya shook her head vehemently. You didn't fail. You saved me. If you hadn't shown up when you did, her voice trailed off, the thought too horrifying to finish. Marcus's grip on her hand tightened slightly, a silent promise that he would never let anything like this happen again. That man, he said, his tone hardening, is going to pay for what he did. Not just to you, but to everyone he's hurt. I'll make sure of it. Maya hesitated, then asked, do you think he'll really face justice? Or is he just going to walk away like they always do? Her words stung, a bitter truth he couldn't deny. Not this time, Marcus said firmly. I'll make sure of that. He's not just facing criminal charges, he's facing the entire system he thought he could manipulate. Maya studied her father's face, searching for reassurance. You really think it's enough? To stop people like him? It has to start somewhere, Marcus replied, his voice filled with determination. And I'll fight like hell to make sure it starts here. The door to the conference room opened abruptly, and one of Marcus's colleagues stepped inside. Marcus, the man said, his tone urgent. You need to see this. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Maya before rising to follow the man into the adjoining control room. Maya trailed behind, her curiosity piqued. Inside, a row of monitors displayed live footage from the holding cells. On one of the screens, Travers was pacing back and forth, his face a mask of barely contained fury. What's going on? Marcus asked, his voice tense. The officer gestured toward the monitor. He's been ranting ever since we put him in there. Keeps saying he'll expose something if we don't cut a deal. Marcus's jaw tightened. Expose what? The officer hesitated. He hasn't said exactly. But he's confident, almost smug. Maya frowned, stepping closer to the monitor. What could he possibly have to expose, she asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the screen, his mind racing. Travers's expression was more than just anger, it was the look of a man who believed he still held the upper hand. Marcus knew that look well. He had seen it countless times during his career, in the faces of criminals who thought they could outsmart the system. Let's find out, Marcus said finally, his voice cold and determined. Minutes later, he entered the holding cell, the door clanging shut behind him. Travers looked up, his lips curling into a smirk. Agent Jackson, he drawled, his tone dripping with mock politeness. To what do I owe the pleasure? Marcus didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared down at Travers, his expression unreadable. You said you had something to share, he said. Speak. Travers leaned back against the wall, his smirk widening. Oh, I do. But first, let's talk about this little vendetta of yours. You really think you're the hero in all this? Marcus's eyes narrowed. This isn't about me. It's about justice. Justice? Travers laughed, the sound hollow and bitter. That's rich, coming from someone like you. Marcus ignored the jab. If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, sit here and think about the decades you're about to spend behind bars. Travers's smirk faltered for a moment, but then he straightened, his eyes gleaming with defiance. You think this ends with me? He asked. You think I'm the only one? Marcus's stomach turned, but he kept his expression neutral. What are you trying to say? Travers stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I'm saying you've barely scratched the surface. There are others, higher-ups, who knew exactly what I was doing. Hell, they encouraged it. And if I go down, I'm taking them with me. Marcus stared at him, the implications of his words sinking in like lead. Travers saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes and seized the moment. That's right, he said, his tone triumphant. You think you're fighting the system, Jackson? The system doesn't care about people like you or your daughter. It chews you up and spits you out. You're just a cog in the machine. Marcus clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. If you think threatening me will get you out of this, you're sorely mistaken. Travers shrugged. It's not a threat. It's a reality. You can take me down, sure. But the ones pulling the strings? They'll still be out there, laughing at you while you play hero. Marcus leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. You can try to shift the blame all you want, but it doesn't change what you did. You're going to face justice, Travers. And if there are others involved, I'll find them too. Travers's smirk returned, but this time it lacked its earlier confidence. Good luck, he sneered. You're going to need it. As Marcus turned to leave, Maya's face flashed in his mind. Her fear, her resilience, her unwavering belief in him, it was all the motivation he needed. He wouldn't stop until Travers and everyone like him were held accountable. For Maya, for the countless others who had suffered in silence, he would see this fight through to the end. The hallway outside the interrogation room was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Marcus's mind. He stood with his back against the wall, his arms crossed, staring blankly at the far end of the corridor. Maya was waiting in a nearby office, but her voice echoed in his thoughts, the lingering tremor of fear in her tone fueling the fire in his chest. He had just faced Travers, peeling back the layers of corruption he'd long suspected but never fully grasped. Now, it wasn't just about Travers, it was about the entire web that man had hinted at, and the fight ahead seemed larger and more daunting than ever. A colleague, Agent Daniels, approached with a stack of documents in hand, his face tense. Marcus, he said quietly, we're compiling everything Travers mentioned. There are some names, high-ranking officers, even a few politicians. It's worse than we thought. Marcus nodded grimly. It always is, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. He flipped through the documents Daniels handed him, each name and allegation another brick added to the crushing reality of what they were up against. What's the move? Daniels asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, balancing the need for swift action against the potential blowback of targeting powerful figures. His hesitation wasn't fear, it was strategy. If they moved too soon, the system could close ranks, burying evidence and protecting the guilty. But if they waited too long, they risked losing momentum and, worse, justice for Maya. We build the case, Marcus finally said, his voice steady. We go after them all, but we do it right. No loopholes, no technicalities. I want everything airtight. Daniels nodded. Understood. As Daniels walked away, Marcus let out a long, slow breath. He knew this fight would consume him, but it wasn't a choice, it was a responsibility. For years, he had worked to dismantle systems of corruption, but now it was personal. Travers's words haunted him, not because of their malice but because of their truth. The system wasn't built to protect people like Maya, and he was painfully aware of how easily it could fail her again. Inside the office, Maya sat at a desk, her fingers nervously tapping against her knee. When Marcus entered, she looked up, her eyes searching his face for answers. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with apprehension. Marcus closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her. "It's bigger than we thought," he admitted. Travers wasn't acting alone. He was part of something much larger, something that's been allowed to fester for years. Maya frowned, her mind racing to process his words. "So, it wasn't just him?" she asked. "No," Marcus replied, his tone heavy. "But that doesn't absolve him of what he did. He's still responsible. And now, we have a chance to take down everyone who enabled him." Maya leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "But will it actually change anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Even if you take them down, what's to stop someone else from taking their place? What's to stop this from happening to someone else?" Marcus hesitated, her words striking a chord he couldn't ignore. "It's not going to be easy," he admitted. "And it won't happen overnight. But if we don't fight, nothing will change. It has to start somewhere." Maya nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "Then let's start here." Her words stirred something in Marcus, a renewed sense of purpose. He reached across the desk, placing a hand over hers. "You've been through more than anyone should ever have to endure," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But you're stronger than you know. And together, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Daniels entered, his expression serious. "Marcus, there's something you need to see." The two followed Daniels to the surveillance room, where a monitor displayed a live news broadcast. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen: "Officer involved in attempted murder of teen tied to widespread corruption scandal." The footage cut to Travers being escorted from the precinct in handcuffs, his face obscured by the barrage of cameras and reporters. The news anchor's voice filled the room. "New details are emerging about Officer Daniel Travers, who is now the subject of a federal investigation into allegations of corruption and abuse of power. Sources within law enforcement confirm that this case could implicate several high-ranking officials." Marcus's jaw tightened. The media frenzy was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it brought attention to the case, ensuring that the public would demand accountability. On the other, it meant heightened scrutiny and the risk of leaks that could jeopardize their investigation. "This is going to get messy," Daniels said, voicing what they were all thinking. "It already is," Marcus replied. "But that's not going to stop us." As the broadcast continued, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a call from an unknown number. Frowning, he stepped into the hallway to answer. "Agent Jackson," he said curtly. There was a pause on the other end before a deep, measured voice spoke. "Agent Jackson. You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "Let's just say I'm someone with a vested interest in this case," the voice replied. "And I'm calling to offer you some advice. Drop it. Walk away now, and you might just keep your career intact." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his anger simmering just below the surface. "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality," the voice said calmly. "You think you can take down an entire system? You're just one man. And when you fail, it's not just you who'll suffer, it's your daughter, too." The line went dead. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of the warning settling over him. But instead of fear, it fueled his determination. Whoever was behind this had just made a critical mistake. They had underestimated him. He returned to the surveillance room, his expression unreadable. Maya looked up at him, her concern evident. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing I can't handle," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "But we're running out of time. We need to move fast." The rest of the team nodded, their resolve matching his own. The fight was far from over, but Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wouldn't stop until justice was served, no matter the cost. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as the judge entered and took her seat at the bench. Marcus sat in the front row, his suit impeccable, his expression steely. Beside him, Maya held her head high, her presence a quiet defiance in the face of everything she had endured. This was more than a trial, it was a reckoning. Not just for Travers, but for everyone who had turned a blind eye to his abuses. The prosecutor rose, delivering a closing argument that outlined Travers's pattern of misconduct. Evidence of his corruption had been meticulously presented over the course of weeks, each piece building a damning case. The video of Maya tied to the train tracks, the testimonies of other victims, and the trail of bribes and falsified reports left no room for doubt. Travers sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of exhaustion and thinly veiled anger. The arrogance he once wore like armor had been stripped away, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had built his power on the suffering of others. His defense lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Travers didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson's voice rang out clearly, guilty on all counts. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. Marcus closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. Maya reached for his hand, her grip firm. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest felt lighter. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their signs and chants a powerful testament to the impact of the case. News cameras captured every moment as Marcus and Maya stepped into the sunlight, the reporters clamoring for a statement. Marcus raised a hand to quiet the crowd. His voice was firm but measured as he spoke. Today, justice was served. But this is only the beginning. What happened to my daughter should never happen to anyone. It's time to hold not just individuals, but entire systems accountable for the harm they've caused. This fight isn't over. And I will keep fighting. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a chorus of hope and determination. In the days that followed, the case sparked a ripple effect across the country. High-ranking officials implicated in Travers's network were arrested, and internal reviews led to sweeping reforms in law enforcement practices. A new task force was established to root out corruption, and Marcus was asked to lead it. Though hesitant at first, he accepted the role, knowing it was an opportunity to create lasting change. For Marcus, it wasn't just about the job, it was about keeping his promise to Maya and to every family affected by abuse of power. Maya, too, found her voice in the aftermath. She became an advocate for young people, speaking at schools and community events about her experience and the importance of standing up against injustice. Though the scars of her ordeal remained, she refused to let them define her. Instead, she used them as fuel to inspire others. As for Travers, his conviction carried a lengthy prison sentence. Stripped of his badge and his influence, he faced the consequences of his actions in the very system he had once manipulated. In prison, he was just another inmate, his power and privilege reduced to nothing. Months later, Marcus and Maya stood at the opening of a new community center named in her honor. The building was vibrant, filled with art, laughter, and the promise of a brighter future. As they walked through the halls, Maya stopped to admire a mural painted by local students, a depiction of resilience and hope rising from the shadows. "This is what it's all about," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. Maya nodded, her eyes glistening. "We did it, Dad." "No," he corrected gently. "You did it. You showed the world what real strength looks like." That night, as they sat on the porch of their home, the stars above them bright and endless, Marcus looked at Maya and felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he knew they had made a difference. To everyone watching this story unfold, there's a powerful lesson here. Justice isn't something that happens on its own. It's something we must fight for, day in and day out. It's not just the responsibility of one person or one family, it's a collective effort to demand accountability, to challenge systems that perpetuate harm, and to build a future where everyone can feel safe and valued. What would you have done if you were in Marcus's shoes? How would you have handled Maya's fear, Travers's arrogance, and the weight of an entire system resisting change? Share your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear your voice. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more gripping narratives that challenge the way we see the world. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay strong and stand for what's right.